My wife walked through the door, and I asked point blank, "Do you love him?" She set her bag down slowly. "Him? Who?" I said, "Todd." Her face went white. After 14 years of marriage and 2 kids, she couldn't even deny it. "My name is Craig Price. I'm 44 years old, and I'm a mortgage underwriter at Pinnacle Lending Group in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've worked there for 11 years, and I'm good at what I do, finding the truth inside a stack of numbers, spotting the lie buried in a balance sheet. Turns out, I was better at reading other people's finances than I was at reading my own marriage. Allison and I met in our late 20s at a charity auction. She was laughing at something her friend said, and I remember thinking I'd never seen anyone so comfortable in a room full of strangers. We dated for 2 years, got married at 29, and spent the next 14 building what I thought was a solid life together. 2 kids, Mason, who just turned 13 and would rather die than admit he still likes it when I show up to his baseball games, and Zoe, 10 years old and already the most opinionated person in her household. Allison ran the design side of a mid-size interior design firm called Alara Studio, where she'd made partner 3 years ago. I was proud of her, genuinely proud. She had a talent for turning empty spaces into something people wanted to live inside, and her clients adored her. What I didn't realize was that her firm had recently taken on a corporate wellness consulting contract, and the consultant in question was a guy named Todd Archer. I first heard his name in November, somewhere between Thanksgiving and the first snowfall. Allison mentioned him the way you mention a coworker. Casually, briefly, like the name meant nothing. Todd suggested a different layout for the Henderson project. Todd had this idea about incorporating biophilic elements. Todd. I didn't think much of it. People talk about their colleagues. That's normal. That's just work. By January, the name was showing up at the dinner table. Todd had recommended a new yoga studio downtown. Todd had a contact at a sustainable furniture supplier. I started to notice, in the abstract, clinical way I noticed things at the office, that she said his name the same way every time, a little too easily, like she'd been practicing keeping it neutral. I filed it away and kept moving. Mason had a winter baseball showcase. Zoe was preparing for a school science fair. I was deep in a complex commercial refinancing case that had been eating my hours for 3 weeks. Life was loud and full, and it was easy to dismiss a name. Then came the evening in late January when I got home early. A closing fell through, and I was back by 4:30. The house was quiet. Allison wasn't home yet. I set my bag on the counter and noticed her laptop sitting open near the kitchen island, screen still glowing. I wasn't snooping. I was reaching past it to grab my phone charger from behind the counter. The screen was at the wrong angle to read clearly, but one line of text caught my eye before I could look away. "I keep thinking about yesterday. Tell me you feel it too." The name at the top of the message thread was Todd Archer. I straightened up slowly. My hand had stopped moving. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, the refrigerator humming behind me like nothing in the world had changed. I didn't open the laptop. I didn't read any further. I walked to the living room, sat down in my chair, and stared at the wall. In my line of work, one anomalous number doesn't prove fraud, but it tells you where to look. And once you start looking with purpose, the picture almost always gets a whole lot uglier than that first red flag suggested. I was already looking. I just didn't know yet how ugly it was going to get. I gave myself one night to sit with what I'd seen, to let the shock settle into something I could actually work with. I didn't confront Allison. I didn't ask questions. I made dinner, helped Zoe with her math homework, listened to Mason complain about his history teacher, and went to bed at my usual time. Allison fell asleep beside me like she always did, and I lay there in the dark staring at the ceiling, my mind already sorting through the information the way I sort through a loan file, methodically, without emotion, looking for the pattern underneath the surface. By morning, I had a plan. I waited until Allison left for work and the kids were on the school bus. Then I sat down at the kitchen counter with a fresh cup of coffee and opened her laptop. I want to be clear about something. In 20 years of adult life, I had never once invaded Allison's privacy. Not her phone, not her email, not her journal when she used to keep one. I believed in trust the way some men believe in religion, completely, without requiring proof. What I was doing now felt like stepping off a cliff, but I'd already seen the ground rushing up at me. I needed to know how far the fall was going to be. The message thread with Todd Archer loaded instantly. She hadn't even closed it. I read everything. It took 40 minutes. 6 weeks of messages. Maybe longer on her phone. The laptop only showed what had synced through the shared account app she'd forgotten was connected. What I found was methodical in its own ugly way. The early messages were careful, professional, with just enough warmth to be deniable. Then around the third week, something shifted. The language changed. The distance collapsed. By the most recent messages, there was nothing deniable about any of it. What stopped me cold wasn't the affection. It was something else. A message from Allison dated 3 Sundays ago, sent at 11:14 in the morning while I was outside in the yard raking leaves with Mason. He's a good man, but he doesn't see me anymore. I feel invisible in my own house. You're the first person in years who's actually listened. I read that line 4 times. Each time it landed differently. The first time it just hurt. The second time I felt something harden behind my sternum. The third time I started thinking about every conversation we'd had in the past year, every dinner, every weekend, every moment I thought we were fine. The fourth time I understood exactly what she had done. She had handed Todd Archer a key to my marriage by telling him where the lock was weak. She told him my weaknesses, my blind spots, the gaps she felt I'd left unfilled. She'd mapped the interior of our relationship and handed him the blueprint. That, more than anything else, was the betrayal I couldn't get past. I closed the laptop. I rinsed my coffee cup. I stood at the kitchen window for a long moment, watching a pair of cardinals work the feeder I'd put up last spring. Then I walked to my home office, sat down, and pulled out a fresh legal pad. I'm an underwriter by trade. My job is to assess risk. So that's what I did. I assessed the full picture before making a single move. First, I called my attorney, a man named Bill Garrett who'd handled some estate work for my parents 3 years back. I didn't tell him everything, just enough. I asked about documentation, about what was admissible in family court proceedings in North Carolina, about custody frameworks. He told me to start keeping records and to avoid any action that could be characterized as hostile or retaliatory. I wrote down everything he said. Second, I spent 2 hours going through our joint financial accounts. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but if Allison had been distracted for 6 weeks, I wanted to know if that distraction had touched our money. What I found surprised me. 3 transfers over the past month, each around $800, to an account I didn't recognize. The description read ELR Consulting, LLC. I wrote down the account number and circled it twice. Third, I picked up Mason for baseball practice that afternoon and bought him a burger on the way home. He talked about his coach for 15 minutes straight, and I listened to every word, laughing at the right moments, asking the right questions. When we got home, Zoe was already at the kitchen table drawing something elaborate in color pencil, and I sat beside her and looked at it like it was the most important thing in the world. Because it was. That evening, Allison came home at 6:30, set her bag on the counter, and started talking about a client presentation she had the next morning. I listened. I responded normally. I handed her a glass of water when she reached past me, and our hands briefly occupied the same space, and I felt absolutely nothing, which told me that the part of me that had once loved her without question was already standing behind a wall. Later, after the kids were in bed, I sat in the office with the door closed and opened my laptop to a blank document. I typed 2 words at the top of the page, full picture. Then I started filling it in. Every date, every inconsistency, every financial irregularity, every detail from the message thread I'd read that morning. I built the case the way I'd build a file for a difficult underwriting decision, completely, carefully, without leaving anything to interpretation. Because when the moment came, and it was coming, I was not going to be caught unprepared. I gave it 4 more days. 4 days of normal. School runs, work, dinner at the table, helping Mason with a geography project, watching Zoe perform a dramatic retelling of something that happened at recess. For days of sleeping beside a woman I no longer recognized while my legal pad filled up with dates, figures, and a growing picture I wished I could unsee. On the 5th day, I called Bill Garrett again and told him I had documentation. He said I was ready to have the conversation. That evening, I arranged for Mason and Zoe to sleep over at my mother's house. I told her I had a work situation that needed my full attention that night, which wasn't entirely untrue. My mother didn't press. She never did. She just said she'd make pancakes in the morning and that the kids were always welcome. I was home by 6. Allison's car was already in the driveway. She was in the kitchen unloading groceries when I walked in, moving with that efficient, practiced energy she always brought home from the office. Heels still on, jacket still buttoned, the physical version of a woman who hadn't yet switched off from the day. She smiled at me over her shoulder. "Where are the kids?" "At my mom's," I replied, setting my keys on the counter. I thought we needed some time to talk. The way she stilled, just slightly, just for half a second, told me everything about her conscience. She recovered fast, but not fast enough. "Sure," she said evenly. "Let me just finish putting these away." I waited at the kitchen table. I didn't pace, didn't rehearse lines in my head. I'd been an underwriter long enough to know that the best conversations happen when you let the evidence speak first and your emotions speak last. She sat down across from me, and for a moment we just looked at each other across 14 years of shared life. The table we'd bought at an estate sale, the window above the sink we'd argued about replacing for 3 years, the photographs on the refrigerator covered in Zoe's drawings. I kept my voice level. When my wife walked through the door tonight, I knew I had to ask her something directly. So I'm going to. She waited. "Do you love him?" Allison set her hands flat on the table slowly, like she was steadying herself. "Love who?" she asked, her voice careful and quiet. "Todd." I watched her face. "Todd Archer." The color left her face in a single wave. Her mouth opened and then closed. For a long moment the kitchen was completely silent. Just the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower somewhere down the block. After 14 years of marriage and 2 kids together, she couldn't even deny it. The truth was written all over her before she said a single word. "Craig, just answer it," I said. "You owe me that much." Her eyes filled. She looked down at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's complicated." "It's not," I answered flatly. "It's the simplest question I've ever asked you." What followed was an hour I'll never fully describe, not because I can't remember it, but because some things don't need to be reconstructed in detail. She admitted it. She said she hadn't planned it, that it started as a professional connection and grew into something she hadn't known how to stop. She said she was confused. She said she still cared about me. She said a lot of things that people say when they're trying to soften the edges of what they've done. What she didn't do was tell me about what she told him. Not that night. That part one already knew from the messages, that she'd handed Todd Archer a guided tour of my weaknesses, painting me as a man too distracted to see his wife. I decided to keep that card face down for now. I asked her to stay at her sister's for a while. She looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my face must have communicated that this was not a negotiation. She packed a bag that night. Before she left, she stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said she was sorry. "I know you are," I told her, and I meant it. Sorry doesn't rebuild what's gone, but I meant it. After she left, I stood in the quiet house for a long time. Then I called Bill Garrett, left a message that I was ready to proceed formally, and went upstairs to make sure the kids' rooms were in order for when they came home the next morning. The file on my desk was ready. The documentation was clean. And the man who'd spent 14 years assuming the best about the people closest to him had learned, once and for all, to verify before he trusted. 3 days after Allison moved to her sister's place, I got a visitor I wasn't expecting. It was a Saturday afternoon. Mason was at practice. Zoe was at a birthday party 2 streets over. I was in the garage reorganizing the shelving unit I'd been putting off for months. One of those mundane physical tasks you throw yourself into when your mind needs somewhere to go that isn't the inside of your own chest. I heard the car first. A black SUV, newer model, parking directly in front of the house with the kind of deliberate care that told me the driver had been there before, or at least had thought about this moment more than once. I set down the shelf bracket I was holding and walked to the edge of the driveway. Todd Archer was taller than I'd expected. 40, maybe, with the kind of groomed confidence that comes from spending too much time in rooms where everyone agrees with you. He was dressed like a man who wanted to look casual, but had tried too hard to get there. Pressed chinos, fitted pullover, the whole curated package. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave, or what might have been a peace offering, and walked toward me at a measured pace. I didn't move. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sincerity. "Craig, I know this isn't what you want, but I needed to talk to you man to man." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. "You're standing in my driveway. Talk." He took a breath. "I want you to know that I'm not your enemy here. What happened between Allison and me, I know how it looks. But you need to understand that she came to me. She told me things about your marriage that made me believe she was in a bad situation." I kept my expression completely neutral. "What kind of situation?" She told me you were controlling, Todd said, his voice dropping like he was confiding something difficult. That you monitored her finances, isolated her from her friends, that there had been times when she felt genuinely afraid in this house. She said the kids were caught in the middle of it. He paused. I thought I was helping her. I thought she needed someone in her corner. I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. A cardinal landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard and sat there like a small red witness. So let me make sure I understand, I said evenly. Allison told you I was abusive, and your response was to have an affair with her. Something moved across his face, a flicker of something that wasn't quite certainty anymore. I was trying to. To what? I cut in, my voice still calm, still level. Save her from a house where she was a partner in a thriving business, where her children were safe and healthy, where every bill was paid and every vacation was planned. That's what you were saving her from. He shifted his weight. I only knew what she told me, and you didn't think to question it. I took one step forward, not threatening, just closing the conversational distance to something that couldn't be avoided. You didn't think it was worth a second look before you decided to walk into another man's marriage. You just believed what was convenient to believe, because it made what you wanted to do feel justified. Todd opened his mouth and closed it again. For a man who made his living coaching people through difficult conversations, he was doing a poor job of navigating this one. Here's what I want you to understand. I continued. My children live in this house. Whatever story Allison told you, my kids are not part of your narrative. They are not a reason. They are not a justification. And they are not going to know your name for any reason other than the one they'll eventually figure out on their own. I took a step back toward the garage. We're done here. Don't come back. Todd Archer stood there for another few seconds. That rehearsed composure fully dissolved now, looking like a man who had arrived expecting a different scene. Then he walked back to his SUV, got in, and drove away. I watched the vehicle turn the corner. Then I went inside, picked up my phone, and called Bill Garrett. Todd Archer just showed up at my house, I said when he answered. A brief pause. What did he say? Enough, I replied. I need to know where we stand on the temporary custody order. The first 2 weeks after Allison moved to her sister's place were the strangest of my life. Not because of the absence. I'd half expected to feel that like a missing limb. What surprised me was how much of the daily machinery still ran. The alarm still went off at 6:15. Mason still needed his cleats found. Zoe still wanted her hair braided a specific way that I was slowly, badly learning to do. The house still had to be fed, maintained, driven, scheduled. Life didn't pause out of courtesy for my situation, and in a strange way, I was grateful for that. I told the kids that Mom and I were going through a rough patch and needed some space to work things out. Mason nodded in that particular way 13-year-old boys nod when they're processing something they don't want to fully acknowledge yet. Zoe asked 3 direct questions. Was it her fault? Were we getting divorced? Would she still see Grandma Gloria? And I answered all 3 honestly and without hedging. No, I don't know yet. Absolutely yes. She seemed to accept that. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, but they're also sharper than we want to believe. What I didn't tell them was what I found on a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks into our new arrangement. I'd been reviewing our household accounts more carefully since the separation, part due diligence, part habit, and I traced the ELR Consulting LLC payments I'd spotted earlier. The LLC was registered in Delaware, which meant minimal public disclosure, but the registered agent address matched the co-working space where Todd Archer's wellness consulting firm operated. 3 payments of $800 each, $2,400 total, moved out of our joint household account over 6 weeks. Allison had been quietly funneling money toward Todd Archer's business under the guise of a consulting arrangement. Whether that was emotional generosity or something more calculated, I couldn't say. But it was marital money, and it was gone, and she hadn't mentioned a word of it. I photographed every record, forwarded everything to Bill Garrett, and said nothing to Allison directly. Not yet. What I did instead was focus on the children with an intensity I'm not sure I'd managed, even before the marriage fell apart. I showed up to Mason's Saturday morning practice and stood at the fence for 2 full hours in 40-degree weather. His coach, a retired high school teacher named Gary, caught my eye at one point and gave me a quiet nod, the kind men exchange when words would be redundant. Mason pretended not to notice I was there until the last 10 minutes, when he hit a clean line drive up the middle and turned instinctively to see if I'd seen it. I had. I raised my fist. He ducked his head to hide a grin. Then came the afternoon that nearly undid me. Zoe came home from school on a Friday, carrying a hand-drawn card. The kind she made for every occasion, with elaborate borders and her particular style of block lettering. She set it on the kitchen counter while I was making dinner, and I assumed it was for me or for Mason. I glanced at it while stirring a pot of pasta. The front read, "For Todd, from Zoe. Thank you for the art kit." I turned the heat down on the stove. Slowly, inside, in her careful 10-year-old handwriting, "Mom said you picked it out yourself. It has the good colored pencils. You're really nice." I stood there holding that card for a long time. Allison had allowed Todd Archer to send my daughter a gift. A deliberate, personal gift. Not a generic thing, but an art kit chosen specifically because Zoe loved to draw. He knew that detail because Allison had told him. He'd been gathering information about my children the way a man does when he's planning to be part of their lives. I set the card face down on the counter, finished making dinner, and got through the evening with every internal alarm I had ringing at full volume. That night, after both kids were asleep, I called Bill Garrett and told him about the card. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Craig, I want you to document the gift, document the card, and bring everything to our meeting next week." This speaks to intent. Whose intent? I asked. Both of theirs, he replied. I sat in the kitchen after I hung up, in the same chair where I'd confronted Allison 2 weeks earlier, and I looked at the refrigerator covered in Zoe's artwork, drawings she'd made over years, layered and overlapping, a whole chronicle of her childhood pinned up in colored pencil and marker. None of it included a stranger's name. None of it was supposed to. Spring arrived in Charlotte with that particular southern urgency. 1 week gray and cold, the next suddenly green and loud with birds, like the season had somewhere to be. I barely noticed. My attention was elsewhere. Bill Garrett had been methodical and thorough, which was exactly what I'd needed. By late March, we had filed for divorce and submitted a formal custody petition citing marital waste, the $2,400 transfer to ELR Consulting LLC, and a pattern of behavior that compromised the children's stability. Allison's attorney responded quickly, and the back and forth of legal correspondence had become a grim new feature of my weeks. Then Harriet Colton, a senior partner at a commercial lending firm I worked with regularly, called me with something unexpected. We were at a quarterly industry lunch, the kind of event I usually treated as routine, when she leaned across the table during dessert and lowered her voice. "I want to mention something, and I'm telling you this as a professional courtesy." I set down my coffee. "Go ahead." "Todd Archer," she said. The name landed differently in that context than it ever had before. "My firm used his wellness consulting services for about 4 months last year," Harriet continued. "We terminated the contract in December. The results he billed us for didn't match the deliverables we received. My operations director dug into it. We were charged for team sessions that never happened, and the expense invoices included line items for materials that we never saw." She paused. I moved on quietly because the amounts didn't justify litigation. "But when I heard through the grapevine that your wife worked with him, I wanted you to know." I kept my expression neutral, but something cold and clear was settling behind my eyes. "Did you document it?" "Enough," Harriet replied. "If you ever needed it." I thanked her and drove home in silence. That evening I pulled up everything I had on ELR Consulting LLC and looked at it with new eyes. The payments from our household account weren't just marital waste. They were potentially connected to a pattern of fraudulent billing that Archer had been running across multiple clients. Allison either knew about it and participated, or she'd been moved to transfer money by a man who knew exactly how to make requests feel reasonable. Either scenario was damaging to her case in family court. I spent 2 hours that night building a secondary file, Harriet's account, the LLC records, the payment timeline, and forwarded it to Bill Garrett with a note. Possible pattern of fraudulent billing. Allison's transfers may be directly connected. Verify before we proceed. Bill called back the next morning. "This changes the financial picture considerably," he said. "If Archer's billing practices are as broad as your contact suggests, the transfers from your joint account could be characterized as facilitation of fraud. I'd recommend we bring in a forensic accountant." I hired one by the end of the week. While that process began, life at home continued in its new shape. Allison had the kids on alternating weekends, and the exchanges were polite in the way that two people are polite when there are lawyers involved and children watching. Mason had started asking sharper questions, the kind that come from a teenager who's done his own thinking. One evening while I was checking his homework, he looked up from his textbook. "Dad, is Mom's situation at work connected to why you two split up?" I looked at him steadily. "Why do you ask?" "Jason's dad said something about Todd Archer's company being in some kind of trouble." He kept his eyes on mine. I put together. 13 years old. I'd underestimated him. "I'm not going to lie to you," I said. "There are things happening that are being handled through the right channels. What I can tell you is that none of it is your problem to carry." Mason nodded slowly. Then he went back to his textbook. I sat with that for a long time after he went to bed. My son was connecting dots I hadn't even finished drawing yet, which meant I needed to move faster than I thought. There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from watching a complicated system work exactly the way it was designed to. I'd felt in my career a dozen times. A loan application that looked clean on the surface, but fell apart under scrutiny. A borrower who thought they'd buried the liability deep enough. A deal that collapsed the moment someone with the right tools decided to look carefully. The system wasn't perfect, but when it functioned, it was something to respect. By early April, the system was functioning. The forensic accountant Bill Garrett had recommended a compact, precise woman named Linda Cho, who operated out of a one-person firm in Raleigh, had spent 10 days going through ELR Consulting LLC's publicly available registration records, cross-referenced against the payment history from our joint account and the information Harriet Colton had provided about her firm's terminated contract. What she brought back to our meeting was a spreadsheet that told a story even a layperson could follow. Todd Archer had been billing multiple corporate clients for wellness consulting services that were either never delivered or significantly misrepresented. Harriet's firm was one case. Linda had found two others through business registration cross-referencing, a property management company in Durham and a mid-sized dental group in Raleigh, both of which had terminated contracts with ELR Consulting within the past 18 months. The amounts per client were individually small enough to avoid triggering formal complaints, but cumulatively, the pattern was clear. "It's a low-friction fraud structure," Linda explained, tapping the spreadsheet. "He keeps the per-client exposure below the threshold where most businesses bother with litigation. But across a sufficient number of clients, the total is significant." I looked at the numbers. "What's the exposure?" "Conservatively, north of $80,000 across documented cases. Possibly more if additional clients surface." She paused. "The transfers from your joint account fit the same pattern. A modest amount, framed as consulting fee, with no verifiable service delivery." I asked Bill what this meant for the divorce proceedings. He said it strengthened the marital waste claim considerably and gave us standing to seek full restitution of the transferred funds plus legal costs. What also meant, though neither of us said it directly, was that Todd Archer's professional life was about to become very complicated. I didn't file a complaint myself. I didn't need to. Harriet Colton, once I shared what Linda had found, decided that 3 documented cases constituted sufficient grounds to take to the North Carolina Business Court. She had her firm's attorney make the filing on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Todd Archer's consulting license was under review. The news reached me through Harriet in a brief text. "Filed yesterday. Expect suspension of his license within 30 days, pending review. Thought you want to know." I read the message, standing in the parking lot of Mason's school, waiting to pick him up from practice. I put my phone in my pocket and watched the team jog off the field. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was closer to the feeling you get when a long, difficult audit finally closes. Not celebration, exactly, but the quiet recognition that the numbers have told their truth and the appropriate people now know what they are. Mason climbed into the passenger seat, dropped his bag in the back, and looked at me the way he'd been looking at me lately, with those careful, assessing eyes that had started to remind me uncomfortably of my own. "You okay, Dad?" "Good day," I replied, and I meant it. That weekend, Gloria called. Allison's mother was not a woman who called without purpose. She was efficient and deliberate in everything she did, which was where Allison had gotten those qualities before she'd apparently decided to redirect them. Gloria's voice on the phone was measured, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "Craig," she said, "I owe you a conversation I should have initiated weeks ago." I sat down at the kitchen table. "I'm listening." "I knew something was wrong before you did," she admitted. Allison mentioned Todd's name in January in a way that was different from how she mentioned colleagues. I should have said something to her directly. I should have called you. I didn't either, and I'm sorry for that. I was quiet for a moment. Gloria, you're not responsible for what Allison chose. No, she agreed. But I could have made it harder for her to keep choosing it. She paused. Those children need their father. I want you to know that I'll say exactly that to anyone who needs to hear it, including a judge. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long while. The house was quiet. Zoe was drawing at her desk upstairs, and Mason was in his room with his headphones on, and the ordinary sounds of their evening drifted down the hallway like something I wanted to hold on to with both hands. I had Gloria in my corner. I had the financial documentation. I had a forensic accountant's report, a license suspension in progress, and a family court date set for May. Todd Archer had walked in my life believing he was the solution to someone else's problem. He was discovering, 1 week at a time, what it cost to make that mistake. The night before the custody hearing, Mason came to my bedroom doorway at 10:15, which was unusual enough that I set down the document I was reviewing and gave him my full attention. He was holding something, a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases, clearly old. He stood in the doorway with an expression I recognized as the one he wore when he had something important to say and wasn't sure how to start. I found this in Mom's old recipe box, he said, the one in the pantry. I was looking for the card with Grandma's chili recipe because Coach Gary mentioned a cook-off. He held the paper out. I think it's yours. I took it. The paper was lighter than I expected, thin, slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind of stationery that hadn't been manufactured in that way since the early 2000s. I unfolded it. It was a letter I'd written to Allison, early in our marriage. I could tell from the handwriting, younger and more hurried than mine now. I'd written it during a work trip to Atlanta when we'd been married about 2 years, during a stretch when things had been harder between us than usual. My hours were brutal. Her firm was in a difficult patch, and we'd been doing that particular dance of two exhausted people who loved each other, but kept missing the connection. I'd written the letter from a hotel room at midnight and apparently forgotten to mail it, tucked it inside a card she'd sent me for the trip, and at some point it had migrated into a recipe box where it sat for 12 years. I read the first few lines, and then I had to stop. You are the most capable person I have ever loved, and I am aware that I don't say that enough. I think about the life we're building, and I know, with more certainty than I've ever known anything, that it's worth every hard stretch we're in right now. I would choose this again. I would choose you again, every single time. I folded the letter carefully and looked at Mason, who was watching me with that quiet, serious face of his. You read it? I asked. He nodded. I didn't mean to. The first line was right there when I unfolded it. He paused. Dad, did you mean it? When you wrote it? The question settled into the room like something fragile. I looked at my son, 13 years old, standing in my doorway at 10 o'clock at night, holding a piece of the past in his hands and trying to understand how it connected to the present. Yes, I said. I meant every word of it. Then what happened? I thought about that for a moment. Not the simple answer, not the protective answer, the honest one. People change, I said finally. Not all at once, and not always on purpose. Sometimes two people who genuinely love each other end up wanting different things, and by the time they figure that out, it's already caused something that can't be recovered. Mason was quiet. Then, that's not really an answer. No, I agreed. It's not. I looked at him. What I can tell you is that what I wrote in that letter was true when I wrote it. And what I'm doing now is also true. I'm protecting this family in the only way that's left to me. Both things can be real at the same time. He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded, a single, slow nod that reminded me so strongly of my own father that something tightened behind my ribs. Okay, he said. Good night, Dad. Good night, Mason. I sat with that letter in my hands for a long time after his door closed. Then I put it carefully into the drawer of my nightstand, finished reviewing the court documents, and turned off the light. The hearing was in 8 hours. I was ready. May arrived in Charlotte with dogwood blossoms and subpoenas. The family court hearing was scheduled for the second Tuesday of the month. Bill Guerra and I had spent the better part of 3 weeks preparing, reviewing documentation, coordinating with Linda Cho on her forensic accounting testimony, confirming Gloria's written statement, and ensuring that every piece of the file was organized in a format that would survive scrutiny. I'd done this kind of preparation professionally for 20 years. Doing it for my own family felt different. heavier, more specific, but the discipline was the same. You build the case on facts. You let the facts carry the weight. The night before the hearing, I got a call I hadn't expected. Allison's attorney had reached out to Bill asking for a brief settlement conversation before we went before the judge. Allison, he said, did not want to contest the custody arrangement. She was prepared to agree to primary physical custody with me, alternating weekends, and a structured visitation schedule. She also agreed to full restitution of the $2,400 transferred to ELR Consulting, LLC. Bill told me the terms over the phone in the measured voice of a man who'd seen this pattern before. She knows the financial evidence is damaging, he said. Her attorney has advised her not to fight what she can't defend. And Todd Archer? I asked. His consulting license was formally suspended 2 days ago. The North Carolina Business Court accepted Harriet Colton's filing along with the corroborating cases Linda identified. He's also facing a civil suit from the Durham Property Management Company. Bill paused. He's not your problem anymore, Craig. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told Bill to accept the custody terms and proceed with the financial restitution agreement in writing. The following morning, I drove to the courthouse alone. The hearing was brief, 40 minutes, most of it procedural. When the judge confirmed the custody arrangement and signed the order, I shook Bill's hand in the corridor and walked to my car in the May sunshine, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but solidity. The particular solidity of a man who stood his ground through something difficult and came out the other side with his integrity intact and his children secured. What happened next I hadn't anticipated. Todd Archer came to my house that Saturday. Not to threaten, not to argue. He parked on the street and walked to my door and rang the bell like a man who had rehearsed something important. When I opened it, he looked smaller than he had in February, less curated, more worn around the edges, the kind of diminishment that comes not from age, but from consequence. I know I'm the last person you want to see, he opened. You're correct, I replied. But you're here. Talk. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at me. I want you to know that what Allison told me, about you being controlling, about the house being a bad environment, I believed it because I wanted to believe it. I know that now. It made what I was doing feel justified when it wasn't. He paused. She told me your kids were struggling because of you. I should have questioned that instead of using it as a reason. I looked at him steadily. You came here to tell me you were gullible. Something moved across his face. I came here to tell you I was wrong, he said quietly, and that I'm sorry for what it cost your family. The yard was quiet. A car moved slowly down the street. I thought about Zoe's card with his name on it, about the $2,400, about Mason's careful eyes watching me navigate 9 months of damage control. An apology doesn't restore what was lost, I said finally. But I hear you. I kept my hand on the doorframe. Don't come back here again. He nodded once, walked to his car, drove away. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and started making lunch for my kids. The restitution check from Allison arrived the following Thursday, $2,400, exactly as agreed. I deposited it into a savings account I'd opened in Mason and Zoe's names. It wasn't a fortune, but it was theirs, and it was right. 8 months after the night, I stood in my kitchen reading a text message I wasn't supposed to see. I was standing in a different spot, the third base line of a youth baseball field in South Charlotte on a Saturday morning in October, watching my son take batting practice with the kind of focused intensity that made coaches stop what they were doing and pay attention. Mason had grown over the summer, not just physically, though that too, in that sudden teenage way that makes you do a double take, but in some less visible dimension that I noticed in how he carried himself, how he spoke to his sister, how he handled the complexity of moving between 2 households with a composure that would have impressed men twice his age. Zoe was beside me on the bleachers, working through a sketchbook she'd filled to the last 3 pages. She'd started a new one already, half finished in the bag beside her. Art kits had been strictly from me or from Grandma Gloria since the spring, and she seemed entirely unbothered by that continuity. Gloria had been a constant presence through the fall, picking the kids up on Thursdays, appearing at Zoe's school art show with a camera and an embarrassing level of enthusiasm, calling me on Sunday evenings to check in with a directness I'd come to genuinely appreciate. She and Allison were navigating something difficult between them that was not my business to examine. But whatever it was, it hadn't diminished Gloria's commitment to her grandchildren or her fundamental decency toward me. Allison and I had settled into the particular functional neutrality of two people who share children and nothing else. Exchanges were polite and brief. She'd taken on a smaller role at Alara Studio after the divorce finalized. The partnership had been restructured, and she'd lost some client relationships in the fallout from everything connected to Todd Archer's professional collapse. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. I felt, mostly, nothing, which I'd come to recognize as a form of healing. Todd Archer's consulting license remained suspended through the fall, the civil suit from Durham still pending. Harriet Colton mentioned at an industry event in September that 2 additional clients had joined the complaint. Whatever he'd built was coming apart systematically, and it was coming apart because the evidence demanded it, not because I'd wanted revenge. That distinction mattered to me more than I could easily articulate. On the field, Mason stepped into a pitch and hit it cleanly over the shortstop's head. Coach Gary let out a short, approving sound from the dugout. Mason turned instinctively toward the bleachers, the same instinct he'd had since he was 7, the need to verify that someone who mattered was watching. I raised my fist. He ducked his chin to hide the grin, exactly like he always did. Zoe looked up from her sketchbook. He's getting better. He is, I agreed. She went back to drawing. I looked out at the field, the green of the grass, the pale October sky, the other fathers lined up along the fence with their coffee cups and their Saturday morning faces. Ordinary life resumed. Not the same as it had been a year ago, but real and present in mine. That evening I made chili from Grandma's recipe, the one Mason had been looking for when he found my old letter. And we ate at the kitchen table with the back door open, the October air drifting and cool and smelling like fallen leaves. Zoe told a long, elaborate story about something that had happened during art class. Mason corrected 3 factual details in the story, which led to an argument that resolved itself in about 90 seconds. I sat at the head of the table listening to them and thought about what I'd written in that letter 12 years ago in a hotel room in Atlanta. I would choose this again. I would choose you again, every single time. The marriage I'd written those words inside was gone. But the reason I'd written them, the instinct to love what was in front of me with full commitment, to show up and stay, to build something worth having, that hadn't gone anywhere. The kids were still talking. The chili was good. The back door was open to the October evening. I was exactly where I was supposed to be,